Biden's temperament is making headlines. Axios reporting that in private, quote, Biden has such a quick trigger temper that some aides try to avoid meeting alone with him, and that the president's admonitions include how the blank, don't you know this? Don't blank me and get the blank out of here. That's despite him vowing to protect his employees.
I'm not joking when I say this. If you're ever working with me and I hear you treat another colleague with disrespect, talk down to someone, I promise you I will fire you on the spot. On the spot. No ifs, ands, or buts.
Beverly Hallberg is president of District Media Group, and she joins us now. Beverly, good morning to you. More from this Axios article. They write, the private eruptions paint a more complicated picture of Biden as a manager and president than his carefully cultivated image as a kindly uncle who loves aviator sunglasses and ice cream. The White House, Beverly, has declined to comment.
Yeah, well, what I want to know is President Biden going to fire himself for his comments? And what I found interesting about this Axios article is they interviewed aides and staff who try to paint this whole picture that he's just a tough boss who's at the top of his game, who's just trying to challenge his staff to get the best result possible. But there's a difference between somebody being a tough but fair boss and somebody who tells you to get the blank out of the room. I think a lot of us look at this as seeing this about his age, about cognitive decline. He's more of that guy now who is going to yell at you to get off his lawn due to his age. And I think it is concerning. But I think it's also interesting that Axios and the press is starting to talk about President Biden in a negative light. It makes you wonder if they're trying to maybe give a little room for another Democrat nominee to slip in.
Yeah, let's talk about that in a moment. I want to look back at some of the president's more confrontational moments first.
That's a great asset. More inflation. What a stupid son.
Were you sitting there? Were you involved? No, I wasn't. And I don't know. Were you? No.
Look, Beverly, these are just some recent examples. I spoke with somebody years ago, well before Joe Biden ran for this iteration of president. And I asked him point blank, because he's a Politico guy. I was like, who's the worst person in D.C.? And he said, Joe Biden. And I was like, really? Uncle Joe? This is obviously years ago. And so this has been known about Joe Biden for some time. But looking at this through the 2024 lens, is this an attempt by the Democrat establishment, the mainstream media, to get him off the ticket?
I think it may be. I think they're looking at his poll numbers and realizing it's not looking too well for him, or at least his approval rating. I also think that they're looking at the continued gaffes that he makes. We've seen him on this international trip this week, and he does awkward things like not knowing how to interact with the King of England, like looking up awkwardly to see if there are things in the sky. So he just has this behavior where we've seen this in our grandfathers. We've seen this in our grandmothers when we realize dementia has set in. And I think it concerns a lot of people. It's one thing to be able to keep some of this under wraps behind the scenes, but it's to the point where he's not going to be able to campaign from the basement. He's going to have to be out there in front of the camera. And I think Democrats are to the point where they're like, oh, I'm a little bit worried about this. People see through this.
Well, speaking of negative press coverage, over the weekend, Maureen Dowd wrote a piece in the New York Times, and it was titled, "It's 7 grandkids, Mr. President," and it criticized him for refusing to acknowledge Hunter Biden's 4-year-old daughter. Well, on the flip side of that, the ladies of The View actually found a way to defend him over this. Watch this.
This is private, and I know people feel like you need to know everything. I'm sorry, you don't. You need to know not almost anything about people.
But I do feel like if it was Trump, we would talk about it, is the thing. If Trump had a grandkid he wasn't acknowledged, we'll talk about it. He does.
And co-host Anna Navarro also blamed the right wing for weaponizing everything related to Hunter Biden.
Here's the reality. The reason why the press is covering this is because they're trying to defend this child. And this also goes against the narrative that President Biden used on his campaign trail, that he's such a family guy. He's also been known to talk about his grandchildren, naming only 6, even though he has 7, saying he talks to them every day. And it really calls into question this narrative. It doesn't seem as authentic. And I think a lot of us feel for this child where her own father, her paternal grandfather, seem to want to have nothing to do with her. What does that mean for her long term and her psyche? What does that mean for her well-being? So I think it is fair game to call them out on this, especially since President Biden has said all along that family is number one to him.
Beverly, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Beverly.
Thank you.
All right, Dr.